Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Your familiar host, Jeannie Montblanc, couldn't make today's event, so I'm sitting in. My name is Corey Gooker. I work as a project assistant for the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. And on behalf of our team and our partners, I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Ecologically-based invasive plant management for reducing cheatgrass, which will walk you through some lessons learned from area-wide demonstration projects. Before I turn things over to our presenter, I'll run through just a couple of housekeeping items. At any time during the webinar, you can ask questions of me or the presenter by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel at the right of your screen. Following the presentation, I'll be fielding the questions, any questions you've typed in. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange website and YouTube channel soon after it concludes. Today, we are joined by Dr. Roger Sheley, ecologist for the USDA Agriculture Research Service. Dr. Sheley has developed an international reputation as a weed ecologist. He was an extension specialist for invasive plants at Montana State University for about 10 years and is currently a lead scientist for the ARS program in Burns, Oregon. Throughout his career, Dr. Sheley has worked to provide a conceptual framework to help integrate research, teaching, and management associated with rangeland weeds. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Washington State University and his PhD from Oregon State University. By all accounts, Dr. Sheley is truly an invasive species ecology expert and one heck of a nice guy. Please take it away, Dr. Sheley.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. I'm glad I get a chance to visit with you. This is a great way to do it as far as I'm concerned, so it works really well. I'm hoping, and probably I know most of you, so I'm just going to assume that because we're just friends anyway. But what I wanted to do is spend a little bit of time today talking about our area-wide project. And our area-wide project went from 2008 to 2012. But the essence of the area-wide project was to try to help people implement what we developed over the last 25 years or so called ecologically-based invasive plant management for, in our case, dealing with annual grasses, but cheatgrass was a primary target of our effort. What I wanted to do more than anything is give you the idea of what we are doing and give you some of the concepts of how we were approaching and how we do approach invasive plant management, and then we'll take some time to see some exact examples of things that we did, and then mostly though I want to show you some of the materials that are available for you to implement EBI PM types of programs. Now, I know that in land management and invasive plant management is not rocket science, but it's a lot harder than that. And so the idea that we wish we could have a silver bullet control program that would simply take care of the problem has gone by the wayside for some time now. This process that I'm describing today is a little more complicated, and it requires you to think about what you're doing before you decide to do it, and it does not entail a lot of prescriptive techniques because each site and each situation is completely different, and site-specific and time-specific management really isn't doing us any favors. So this tries to circumvent some of that. I think you all know the regular systems problems. In the past, historically, we would be able to move from, we would have sagebrush grass communities primarily throughout the Great Basin and some of the surrounding plant communities. It would infrequently burn and then remove the sagebrush, and then we would just end up with a bunch grass plant community. And then, so that was working well for us for a substantial amount of time, and actually it still works well. But when we start having invasive plants come into the picture, it completely changed the ordinary sort of ecological processes that are occurring out there. And you can see that as we get annual grasses, we can have monocultures of annual grasses. We can also have invasion by annual grasses into brush systems. They will both burn, but they burn. But once they burn, they convert themselves over to monocultures of annual grasses, and these are really very serious problems that we're trying to deal with now. It kind of goes beyond that, though, because as you know, these annual grasses, we used to think, I can remember a time when, you know, in all honesty, we thought cheatgrass was a great early spring forage, but we've gotten to the point now where it's pretty clear that we can't tolerate the kind of fire regime that cheatgrass monocultures will set us upon. So that's becoming probably the biggest issue in the West, is how we deal with these annual grass systems that have continuous fires. Well, I have one way of limiting the number of fires, and I think this is probably the trajectory that most of this annual grass rangeland is probably toward. And I think likely we are creating a type of habitat that's favorable to the invasion by something like yellow star thistle. Yellow star thistle overstory, taking the niche of the sagebrush, and an annual grass understory is, in my opinion, the future direction of many of these areas that have that are dominated by annual grasses. And I do think that because yellow star thistle, when there's enough moisture, will be a later maturing plant. That later maturing green plant oftentimes will help us minimize the number of fires. But the problem you can clearly see is that a cheatgrass yellow star thistle habitat may not burn as frequently, but it's pretty much useless as far as trying to gain the goods and services out of the system that we would like to have. There is another risk to allowing invasion by annual grasses, is also that it can actually get worse, because you can actually, since you only have something really dominating the soil for a short amount of time during the season, if the weather patterns begin to shift and we start getting heavy winds and some rains later in the season, after cheatgrass has completed its life cycle, there is some evidence suggesting that we'll start blowing away and washing away some of the topsoil, which then once we start removing topsoil, we start getting down to lower soil horizons, and nothing can grow there. So there is the notion that some of this land, if left alone to allow the weeds to invade, could actually become more serious than even yellow star thistle annual grass communities. So EBI PM really is focused on what are we going to do about it. We have these areas that are large monocultures that are invitation to new invasive broadleaf plants, and in my opinion, and as one of the basic principles of EBI PM, we really have to stop treating symptoms. And in my view, we don't do this much anymore, but we had spent decades actually trying to treat the symptoms of the problem. When in my belief, it's treating the symptom is a lot like if you had a toothache and you were going to the dentist. The dentist could give you opiates, which on one hand you might really appreciate, but on the other hand, as soon as it wore off and the painkiller wore off, your toothache would come right back. And unless the dentist actually gets down to the root of the problem and understands what's causing that pain and tries to fix that, there's really nothing but a temporary fix. And we've been spending a lot of our time in weed management over the last several decades, spending a lot of time treating symptoms, and I'm arguing that we need to move away from that for sure. Um, and so, well, then what really should we be doing is the question that EBI PM tries to ask, and what we believe really ought to be a more appropriate thing is for us to try to work towards plant communities that are functioning properly, have proper structure, and that also resist invasion once they're established. But then they also need to meet our management objectives. So if we're managing for wildlife or even livestock or whatever we're managing for, we need to have a plant community that's able to provide those services. And in the screen on the left, there's a graph of what I consider to be a reasonably desirable plant community that has lots of forbs, lots of grasses, lots of um, both annual and perennial forb, some deep taprooted, some not, and some sagebrush in the system. And in this case, what we're finding is that the majority of the niches are completely filled. And that way, when some kind of weed like cheatgrass or Russian or a knapweed of some sort shows up, it's very hard for them to get going because all of the niches are being used by something. And if you're aware of this kind of a system that I have, it's got some early emerging things like Sandberg's bluegrass, some later emerging blue bunch wheatgrasses, maybe even there's some Idaho fescue occasionally on some of the wetter ends of things. Um, and then there's these forbs that have tap roots that go down. These early emerging and early senescing plants use up resources in the upper portion of the soil profile, and as the season progresses, the soil profile declines over time. The water in the profile declines over time, and there are species that have access to that to be able to use the resources um, by desired plants throughout the entire growing season. To me, and with all of the data and all of the research we've been working on, this is really the objective of what we should be doing with our invasive plant management programs, because simply controlling the weed is not a viable option, because it just sets a stage for it to come back just as soon as the opiate leaves. Um, on the right, I have a graph that shows some studies that we've done where we increase niche occupation, and on the x-axis there's desirable species richness, 1, 2, or 3 species. These are fairly simple systems. We did design this experiment in a way that as the species richness increases, the um, degree to which these species are occupying separate niches also increase. So you can read desirable species richness as increasing niche occupation, and then we seeded them with cheatgrass, and you can see that as we increased niche occupation by having a diverse group of species, we were able to increasingly create a more and more resistant plant community. These are with native plants. I do think that there are stands of non-native plants that are fairly resistant, crested, fairly resistant to some invasion if you can get them established. But if you're going to work with native plants and native plant systems, I think the diversity notion and the diversity, both temporal and spatial diversity, is a key important factor in maintaining some form of resistance to invasion. And so we're really looking for the nice thing about this is that it also maximizes function and structure in these systems. And so what all of the frameworks and models that I work with and developed in EBI PM have really two sensible sort of objectives that a land manager would be interested in. And one of them is to maximize the amount of productivity that you have, because the maximum productivity uses the maximum amount of the resources that are available during the season, and that if the resources are tied up with something you like, it's harder for something you don't like to get them. And then also to maximize diversity, because maximizing temporal and spatial diversity within a plant community also allows requires maximum niche occupation. And so if all of the niches are filled, then it's clear from the data that we have been collecting over the years that that system will be much more much more able to resist invasion and much less invasible. And it will also meet the other requirements that you have for the system based upon its more functioning, it's functioning at a higher level, it's maximizing productivity at a higher level, and I would make the case that that maximum productivity and diversity are really primary goals, no matter what your situation is and what your particular animals and desires are really for. So the question is, all right, so plant communities change, and we don't want to just treat the symptom. Well, that means we have to understand what the causes are. And when we're trying to figure out what the causes of why weeds are able to invade and dominate, once we understand those causes, then it creates an opportunity for us to adjust those causes and try to see if we can't direct the plant community back on a more desirable trajectory. And that's what EBI PM is really about. EBI PM is, so restoration and invasive plant management are relatively young sciences. And if you think about how some of the older sciences developed, like say engineering, I see us sort of analogous to these folks that have figured out how to build massive bridges across, large rivers, because what they've done for hundreds of years is developed principles and concepts about using physics that create these principles or laws that engineers can use then to design structures that are sustainable and that will carry the same amount of weight in this case that they need to carry, and they can actually use the principles and concepts to design these bridges, for example, in a way that they can serve the purpose that they need to serve. In ecology, now they use physics for their basic science. In land management, we also need to use our basic science, which is ecology. And it's a very underdeveloped topic so far, and the principles and the concepts are just emerging. And so what you're trying to do is develop these kinds of EBI PM programs with partial information, because that's the state of the art. Even though we've been working on it for 50, 60, 80, 100 years, that's nothing compared to the amount of time that's probably going to be required for us to fully understand our science at the level that people who've been studying physics understand. So we're working on it. And what I'm going to do is try to show you over the last 30 years what we've been able to come up with that I think is at least the first form that I know of that's a fairly useful kind of idea. So the idea is, how does it work? One of the fundamental things we're trying to do is move from prescriptions to principles. Prescriptive systems like, do I seed it, do I till it, do I spray it? Those systems just aren't working for us because there's too much site-by-site variation and there's too much year-to-year variation. So something I do today, and it works well for me, is questionably useful to you in someplace else at a different time. It's just not working for us. So we have to move away from the notion of prescriptions and try to see if we can come up with some principles that we could use and a system that we could use to develop management strategies that address the underlying cause of why we have these trajectories towards undesirable vegetation. The simple version of EBI PM is for us to understand the causes of vegetation change, to understand what ecological processes are actually changed that favor directional movement towards something you do or don't like, and then to develop principles that guide managers on how you might address that process so that you could cause the vegetation change that you want, and then to begin to associate those principles with the kinds of practices you might be able to employ to implement a principle that you know needs to be implemented, to affect a process that you know needs to be affected, and then cause the vegetation change that you want. Okay? Well, that's not as hard as it looks, but that's the essence of EBI PM. We're no longer giving you prescriptions, we're just trying to give you some principles. And these principles are based upon the fundamental sciences behind this. One of the simple versions of this that I use as an easy example is, our wildlife refuges here 50 or 60 years ago were really working towards trying to have, and they had mandates for a certain amount of waterfowl, and the water, so they would go to the Steens Mountains and they would turn on a spigot and they would flood everything every year because more waterfowl was the line of logic. But after 60 or so years, you can see the picture on the right, the amount of flooding that was going on was so much that it changed the ecological system and allowed it to be more conducive, or changed to, sorry about that, allow the system to change to much less water. And finally, it was invaded by cattails and tules and things like perennial pepperweed. And then the amount of actual water they had became very, very infrequent, and they didn't have much space for waterfowl. So that whole flooding system created a huge problem. So what we know then is that the cause of the change is that we have water that changes the hydrology of the system, that changes the favorability for particular species that are undesirable. The process is a hydrologically oriented process that has to do with water, timing and frequency of water, and the hydrologic process that's associated with inviting plants that can use more water more often and changing the plant community. So the principle really is pretty simple. You can't flood the area continuously forever, and that you have to think about changing that system or altering that hydrologic process so that the plants that you desire can actually continue to survive in there. And the practice ends up being we have to alternate and rotate the amount of water where we put it and when we put it out, so that there are some dry times out there that the refuge can have, so that things like cattails and tules don't do so well. So it's very simple. This is what the simplest system I can come up with to provide you an example of EBI PM. What's the cause? What's the ecological process? How do we deal with that process as a principle? And then, okay, so how do we make that happen, which is the practice. Okay? So basically, that's the simplest version of the system. But it also gets more complicated when you start thinking about, okay, what about in general, and what about your systems, and especially what about cheatgrass? And how do we deal with cheatgrass and annual grasses? And this is the heart of a more complicated and comprehensive EBI PM program, where the processes that are driving the program are something other than just simply flooding it too much. It becomes more complicated. So the EBI PM process identifies three basic causes of why plant communities change. So this is the cause portion, and it associates each of these causes with a particular or a group of processes, ecological processes, that need to be amended for you to be able to affect that cause. And then also we have put together for cheatgrass and annual grasses a series of these ecological principles that are directions from an ecological perspective of how that disturbance needs to be altered if you're going to influence that particular cause. And so there are ecological processes that are associated with various or ecological principles that are associated with various ecological causes that allow you to address each of these three causes, and ultimately send the plant community on a trajectory towards something that seems to be more productive and have more diversity with species that you're actually interested in having. And these causes are basically adjusting, what niches there are available, what species there are available to fill those niches, and what do we do to plants we like when we get them? How do we make them perform better? And it also is, how do we make the plants that we don't like perform poorer? Okay. And there are these principles that you can employ to direct this successional trajectory by altering these processes. These principles are replacing your prescriptions, and that you're going to actually have to use your ecological knowledge and your ability to think well and use that information to come up with a strategy or a management plan that's more complicated, but also has a much higher chance of being successful for you. We've incorporated, so that's the heart of EBI PM. That's the essence of it. It's addressing the fundamental cause rather than a symptom. It's altering ecological processes, and it has the information on how you alter the ecological processes. The next thing that you get is a 5-step program. Unlike the 12-step program my wife has me on at home, this is just a 5-step program, and it's very simple. You go out and use the rangeland health assessment, and I have made a way to convert that assessment information into identifying which are the likely causes and processes that are the key for whatever system you're actually assessing. So you assess it, turn it into causes and processes, and then once you've identified the causes and processes, you can go to a table like this and some written material, and you can see what the fundamental ecological principle is that would allow this system to move towards something you like. And so here are the things you can do ecologically, not things you can do with a tool, but here's ecologically what you need to do, right? You need to have small scale disturbances. You need to have desired species, really would like to have infrequent disturbances. Those are things that need to be done to that notion of disturbance in order for you to shift the plant community. And then beyond that, we have a series of tools and strategies that we think will make that ecological process happen. And then you can influence the disturbance and the cause and ultimately get some trajectory. There are these principles for each of the different types of ecological processes. So what's cool about this is that it also allows new information to be put into the system when we acquire new ecological principles. It allows us to managers to use this system, but also researchers can. So it gives us both a platform for research and management that allows us to talk about the same kind of framework and work from the same basic notion. And that turns out to be really helpful. And then each ecological principle, these tools and strategies are what you come up with to address whichever of these processes you need to address. And that becomes your integrated weed management plan for shifting the plant community towards undesired to desired. Well, so you can make the plan from that, but it also is placed within an adaptive management framework. So it's really important that we recognize that many of the things that we're going to try. Now, I tested this over the years, and there is one ecological monograph that does the best test. And what it says is that if you use this system compared to what you would have done traditionally without using the system, you will be better off using this system. Well, the old system is effective about 1 in 12 times. So you'll get what you want or something close to you want or a trajectory that you want 1 in 12 times by using more traditional things. By using this one, you can get the trajectory of the plant community to do what you want it to do about 1 in 3 times. So I'm not, as I'm saying, this is an evolving kind of science use, but there's enough here to increase your likelihood of success pretty substantially. So I think it's worth implementing. But we know it's never going to work 100% of the time. It's rarely, and so you have an adaptive management program where you actually put a control out there and you go through several iterations. So you do something, and in 2 or 3 years you go back, you run the 5-step program again, and that tells you what to do next. And then you wait 3 or 5 years, and then you go back out and do it again, and that tells you what you got to do next. That's how it works. All of restoration on wildland systems and rangeland systems that are natural, that have natural evolutionary processes that have determined what they're doing. All restoration of those is not like farming. It's a very iterative process, and it's an ongoing one that probably never is. It's a never-ending attempt to put your plant community on a desirable trajectory. I think that's what we're going to realize about restoration. Why use it? First of all, the prescription management that we're using probably has a really high chance of failing for you, 1 in 12 times. It also, that you're managing based upon ecological prescriptions or principles, and those principles are the heart of the science that we're able to develop for understanding plant community change. It also is a logical thought process. Go out and look, identify causes and principle or prescript processes, figure out how to change the processes, and then figure out what tools you can use to change the process. This is a fairly straightforward program that moves away from the site-specific and time-specific management. Also, we're also addressing the underlying cause of the problem and why plant communities change, and that's very likely very much more successful. It's proven much more successful and more sustainable because changing the underlying cause really does influence it. It's now you're addressing the real reason it's there rather than doing some symptom treating, and that's a huge benefit in the longevity and the sustainability of the kind of management you're employing. And then it's more holistic. It actually allows researchers and managers to work together and uses and provides a nice unified model that managers and researchers can operate off from at the same time and help bridge the gap between those two conversations. So what I'd suggest to people is to go out and look at their land and categorize their land into 3 different situations. They need to understand if they have a light infestation of cheatgrass, then they'll want to focus on prevention. If they have a moderate infestation of cheatgrass, then and there is still some desired species, then you'll want to focus on controlling the weeds as much as you can and doing things to allow the desired species to move forward. You're working a lot in the area of species performance. And then in the worst cases where we have these very severe monocultures of annual grasses, we know that they have to be completely restored. On the bottom here, it shows you that it's important for you to focus on prevention first because it's the highest priority, because it's the biggest bang for the buck. Where you still have some desired species, but also have cheatgrass is the second biggest bang for the buck because you have some species there to help encourage. And so encouraging the plants is part of your management strategy, as well as discouraging undesirable plants. And then we know that the most difficult and less cost-effective and less likely to work programs are those areas that you find high infestations and that revegetation and restoration is. So you can prioritize what you're doing, identify this and work on it first, and then find these and work on it second while you're controlling or containing these so that they don't continue to spread. Okay, well, you're saying that might make sense. Our prevention programs are currently, in my view, are way underdeveloped and under thought out. They require some very sophisticated types of thinking, and in my view, the plants are moving at their biological potential right now, and that all we're doing to fight them is about equal and opposite of all of their ability to move. So we're going to have to step up a more comprehensive type of prevention program. And so I've outlined EBI PM oriented types of prevention programs that I believe to be substantially more effective. It includes education and interruption of movement and early detection and rapid responses to finding new patches. Now, I know this looks like, oh man, I have no chance of looking at this page. In fact, I'm going to start surfing the internet, but don't do it because this is really cool because this is a flow chart of you setting up the best possible invasive plant prevention program for those areas that have small infestations or no infestations. And this is an itemized list of things and processes and a flow chart of things you need to do and how you use the information for feedback information. So it's focused on education, early detection, and interrupting movement, identifying spread vectors and spread things that are causing spread, and developing ways of interrupting that spread. And also, they're going to spread anyway, so you're out looking for them and trying to find them early enough that you can actually keep them from producing seeds. All this time while you're educating people about what plants are coming and what they look like, and what you need to do if you find them. This little model is a really cool I think, tool that will help you make sure that you address the majority of the issues that are associated with a solid prevention program. We've also developed a couple of other tools for you that on the left we've made it clear, I think, about the terminology associated with prevention and tried to make it so that understanding prevention has the terminology to be able to discuss things appropriately. In this map that I'm showing here, you can see that the green zone is the area you're trying to protect. It doesn't have any weeds, but you're trying to protect it. And the yellow areas are action zones where you're actually going to do the work. And in many cases, the red areas here are just simply containment areas where you can't afford to try to go in and do something with it, but you can at least contain it. Those types of terminologies and this type of thinking and these definitions are really useful in trying to understand and talk to one another about how you're going to develop the most effective prevention program for a particular landscape. We also have developed something we changed into a weed wheel, but it's actually a way of trying to use the adaptations that seeds have to predict how they're going to move to be able to then understand and identify what kinds of management strategies are going to help prevent them from moving. We call it the weed wheel. It's published in the 2007 Weed Science, and it actually got the 2007 Weed Science Society of the Year's Paper of the Year award for linking useful ecological information to useful management strategies. And I think you'll find that really valuable. So after we've implemented the best possible prevention programs, we want to go to those locations where we have some desired species in the understory that we can help foster their growth and help them do better. At the same time, we want to weaken the weeds and try to shift the plant community back over towards something we like, or towards a trajectory that is an improvement. And they really are, because you have species here that you like that you can work with. It's a much more doable kind of a program than if you didn't have the native species are so hard to establish that you really need to spend time working in these established, where there are some species already established, and see if you can foster their improvement. But you can do that using that EBI PM model, and it will help you work your way through those types of programs. And they work well. I mean, it works. One of the primary tools that we offer people are how to use grazing to deal with annual grasses, and we developed a grazing strategy and idea that's called green and brown strategy for grazing invasive annual grasses. And what we've found is that if you graze primarily when the annual grasses are green and when the desired grasses and plants are dormant, and put as much pressure on the green grasses, the animals will go to the green and eat the green down to almost nothing because that's where the protein is. And most animals have a high protein need, and they'll select out protein over anything else. So these old decadent plants are high in energy. They have a lot of carbohydrates, but they don't have much for ash, and they don't have any protein. And so you can get cattle to selectively work over the cheatgrass without working over the desired species. And this is the senesced plants are the least susceptible to grazing effects. So you have access to information on making decisions about how you might use cattle in annual grass systems that are a summary and synthesis of all that we know about grazing and grazing management with invasive species, and I think ended up being quite a useful tool. After that, we go to these areas that we worry about most, where they're dominated by annual grasses and they're much more complicated, and we have to pay a lot more attention to what we're doing, and we can lose a lot of money real fast because the costs associated with doing some things on these types of systems are really high and fail a lot. I'm sure most of you know that already. But if you look at it closely, you can plant non-native species like crested. You have about a 50% chance of getting a stand if you do it. And you can figure that if you did $1.6 million worth and you were 50% good, you can figure out how much it's not working. Natives, they're much harder to try to establish, and there's much less, and they're more expensive to try to establish, and they're much less likely to be able to establish using the best technology we have. So that's an important thing. And then finally, if you have natives that, now in this case, with just natives, it didn't have a weed problem, but if you have a weed problem and there's invaders there and you're wanting to get natives, it's even more expensive, and you can see that the likelihood has been, based upon surveys of people who are actually doing this, less than a 5% chance of being successful. So we're really terrible at it. EBI PM will help you have a better chance if you try to employ EBI PM program. So we put together an EBI PM restoration type of strategy. It's a 14-step program, and it's a yes-no dichotomy of questions and answers that help you use it to determine how to develop a management strategy to restore these 100% infested annual grass systems if you're going to restore them. This will give you the best chances. And it's really cool and easy to work with and really fun. We have one for the Great Basin. We also have one for Montana. The basic process and questions are quite similar. The answers are a little bit different. And I'm not going to go through every step of it, but I would encourage you to take a look at that, because if you're trying to develop a restoration strategy to deal with annual grasses, that would be super helpful. But I just show you step one. You ask yourself, like, do we really have to revegetate this area? I mean, will it ever come back on its own? And so we have the criteria that you need to measure your system against to see whether or not it has a chance of coming back on its own, or do you really need to revegetate the entire thing? Seems like a first basic question. And it goes through a series of these questions. In this one, is it a natural site, which is asking, do you need to use native species, because that's going to take you down a different path. If you can use non-native species and try to just restore the structure and function of the plant community, and it doesn't matter which species, then that's a completely different line of thinking on how you would go through that. So you just follow it, yes or no, and then it would go through everything, calculating seed rate. It's all based upon the ecological principles that I've been talking about, and they're associated with it. And there's always a description about the ecological principles that are determining what direction you actually decide to go with your management strategy. And you just go through those 14 steps like this, and at the end, you know what you're going to do. I mean, and it's based upon these ecological principles. That's a cool thing, and I think it's really useful for a lot of people. So I would recommend, if you don't have it, that you might try to find it. There's also then the adaptive management part of it, and most people think that monitoring is going to provide them the management information that's required in order for them to decide what to do next. And in EBI PM, just simply monitoring isn't enough. You have to know whether or not your treatments were actually the cause of the problem, or whether nature and all of the noise, ecological noise that you didn't account for, is determining what's happening, or you determined it. And in order to do that, you have to have predetermined controls that you can measure what happened with against what would have happened had you not done anything. And that's the only way you can assign cause to the kind of management strategy you're putting together. And I think our discussions about monitoring are not sophisticated enough to really help us figure out how to improve management. They're basically just monitoring. I'm not a fan of just monitoring. I know that we have to have a control. Sure, monitor, you can go, hey, this looks really good. You'll never know why. And we need to know why, because we need to know if our management's working or not. So the way I look at this is that we use this to go out and look at the systems that we're working in, decide the level of infestation and desired species that we have, identify those areas that have the ability to implement a solid and comprehensive prevention program, identify those areas where we can actually help the desired species by doing some stuff, and actually control the invasive species to some degree, so that the desired species can start to take over the system, and your trajectory towards desired species is growing and moving along. And then developing more comprehensive and more risky management strategies using EBI PM to restore these weed-infested areas. I think if you do that, and you focus on the prevention and control and increase desired species and revegetation using EBI PM, you'll have much greater success trying to end up with a diverse and productive plant community that has the structure and function to allow maximum production, and also will be harder for the weeds to invade into those systems, because all of the niches are full. And I think the essence of what I can do here, so what I've said is not treatments. I've alluded to you that there are these principles that are developed, and there are, and that we have a list of those principles. We have how to use this system. We have that revegetation using EBI PM guidelines. We have even how to do adaptive management. It's a series of small documents that help you develop the kind of program that deals with the fact that we're dealing with Mother Nature, and she often is not very nice. She's pretty harsh, but you can still help her by implementing these programs that are based upon the underlying ecological information about the system that you're working in. And this is, as far as I know, the first real comprehensive management framework that you can use to come up with ways of shifting plant community dynamics. The goal for me is always to put the plant community on a trajectory towards something you like, and I don't measure success on any final plant community, because I don't believe there is such a thing. But I do think we are improving our system by increasing the number of desired species and increasing the number of the diverseness of the species and the productivity of the system. So that's what I'm trying to get. I encourage you to it's going to take some study, but if you will take the time to get into understanding how this EBI PM stuff works, then you'll really be able to be more effective using sound ecological principles and ideas to develop management strategies that are likely to be much more sustainable. Okay, well, I hope that made some sense to somebody besides me. It always seems to make sense to me, but and I look at the audience and I see glazed eyes and you surfing the internet somewhere else and reading your email. So that worries me, but maybe there's something here you can get a hold of. I hope so. So that's what I had.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sheley. We do have a couple of questions coming in. First one is, do some invasive annual grasses fill a niche that is not filled by any native species?
I think they do. I don't think it's huge. I don't think they're finding and exploiting resources that are uh, to real great amounts. But some of the winter annuals are actually using a an ecological process called resource preemption, and that because they'll germinate in the fall and they'll try to stay alive through the winter, they're actually accessing a temporal niche that our plants, our native plants, struggle to deal with. And so I think they are. And I don't know to what extent that determines the outcome, but I do know you can get some invasion into completely intact communities that I've worked in and seeded into. I can get some invasion into them occasionally, and that to me means, when you think about gopher mounds and things that are happening out on the system, frost heaving and those types of things, there are always disturbances that are being created that invite something new that has the ability to grow fast to be able to take it over. In the long run, though, uh, as long as the soil resources are able to be kept fairly low, those species can't dominate the system very well. So I think you can do it, but I don't think it's perfect. And so yeah, I do think they are exploiting some, maybe through resource preemption more than anything else. But yeah, I think they are.
Okay, looks like one more. Not that we want yellow star thistle, but you mentioned the greenness of yellow star thistle may actually help reduce fire risk. But will the weed succession of yellow star thistle be worse for suppression of native perennials or less suppression compared to cheatgrass?
No, it's the worst thing. I was sort of all being kind of facetious about that whole yellow star thistle thing. I do think one of the main things we have to do with our systems is make sure that we have plants in the system that grow later into the season and be able to extract moisture out of a fairly dry system late into the season, so that when the thunderstorms come, the system is still has some resistance by having high moisture plants in there. And I do think that is one of the strategies that you'll read about when you read about EBI PM. But I was being kind of in my own way cute about this yellow star thistle thing. I do think because it stays greener later into the year, it would minimize the fires, but I think it would raise total havoc on any other positive vegetation that you'd have, and that would be it. So I was just kind of being a little cute with that, but it does bring the point up that in your restoration, making sure that you have species that mature later into the season is going to be a critical part of breaking the fire cycle.
We got one more. Can natives take over from perennial non-natives? For example, crested wheatgrass. Are there other non-native perennial non-native grasses that fade quicker than crested?
I see. To use as an intermediate step towards removing the cheatgrass and then finally removing the non-native plant that was better, and then trying to get back to some native plants. And there are many assisted restoration types of strategies that are ongoing. For me, the fundamental mechanism ends up being that you have to find plants that can that can tie up the amount of resources in the soil. And there are some more ephemeral plants that are even native ones, maybe squirrel tail, that show some signs of being able to begin to tie up resources fairly quickly. Once the resources are tied up in perennation in the material, then the system is less conducive to the cheatgrass. And that's why cheatgrass has to burn itself all the time, is because it needs to release all those nutrients back into the system, because its mechanism for being so dominant is its ability to an intrinsic growth rates, which means its ability to acquire resources when they're not limited is amazing, like 7 or 10 times faster than our native species. The ultimate goal of cheatgrass management has to be to reduce the frequency and availability of especially nitrogen, but of resources in the system, so that they're unavailable and get tied up in perennation. And I think from the standpoint of CO2 and trying to begin to see if we can't tie up some of the atmospheric CO2 that we often worry about, I think that perennation issue is going to be also a major benefit to the environment. So I think fundamentally we just have to tie up a lot of the resources into plants that grow slow but are really competitive and can use resources that when they're in limited supply, and continue to maintain a nice plant community at a very slow pace with slow uptake types of systems, like blue bunch wheatgrass, like Idaho fescue. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think that we've made it through all the questions. I want to thank you, Dr. Sheley, for all the information, and this is pretty fascinating, although complicated stuff. Thanks everyone who attended for your participation, and on the screen hopefully you see some ways to stay connected, and we hope to see you again. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody. If you can still hear me, I really appreciate it for getting the chance to visit with you. You can contact me anytime too, by the way.
Yeah, I haven't cut you off, Roger.
Okay, cool.
Thanks everyone.